A missing man is found murdered in Schenectady, New York.
Not only was he obviously dead, he was nearly frozen. He had at least 2 ligature marks around his neck.
This was a homicide. He died by strangulation.
His loved ones claim he didn't have enemies.
He was nurturing and caring.
I couldn't imagine that type of betrayal.
I said, something's up, more than meets the eye here.
But the clues point detectives to the last people anyone would have expected.
They got together and said, we got to get rid of him.
He was in love with her and wanted to end a toxic marriage so that they could be together.
She manipulated this whole thing. She was the puppet master.
November 23rd, 1995. It's Thanksgiving Day in Schenectady, New York. But instead of celebrating with her family, 30-year-old Stella Lacy is calling police to report her husband, Paul Lacy, missing.
She had seen Paul the previous evening. She went up to bed around 11:30. Paul was downstairs rummaging around the kitchen for something to eat and never came up to bed, which was not unusual. He would sleep on a couch or a day bed on the first floor or go out late, but not coming home that night or the next day was unusual because it was Thanksgiving Day.
It was very odd that Uncle Paul wouldn't be at Thanksgiving, you know. His life revolved around family.
The Schenectady Police Department dispatched somebody to her house to conduct an initial interview.
Officers ask Stella to walk them through the day leading up to Paul's disappearance.
She told the patrolman that Paul had worked Thanksgiving Eve during the day. Ron Faulkner, who was Paul's first cousin, was actually living in the house and had been renting a room from the Lacys. When Paul got home from work, she sent Ron and Paul out to get some bread for the stuffing and a couple other items. And she continued to make Thanksgiving dinner.
Stella says Paul and Ron returned from the store around 11 p.m.
There was a neighbor who lived kitty corner to the Lacey's home. His name was Calvin Smith. And at this time, he stopped over and just to socialize with Ron and Paul, and she went up to bed.
Paul doesn't come to bed that night. The next morning, she believes he may have left to go to work. She had paged him. He doesn't come back. And that's what precipitates her initial filing of the missing persons report.
To go missing on Thanksgiving, it hit us all hard because it's like, we know Paul and he always come home. So this was abnormal.
It's not even 24 hours, but if someone's reported missing, they're put into a national database. In this case, there was a vehicle involved, his 1986 Volvo with a New York plate on it. All this is entered into a database.
The patrol officer asked for a recent photo of her husband, Paul, and if there was any extenuating circumstances that she should know about.
She said he was not a drug user, but Paul was under a lot of pressure. They had some money issues. He lost his job, even though he got a new job at a local Coca-Cola warehouse. You know, they owed a lot of money. Additionally, she said he recently cashed out his 401k for about $8,000, but Paul wouldn't leave the family and the kids on a holiday. At this point, patrolmen interviewed neighbors, but we really didn't get any good leads.
His devotion to his family makes the disappearance even harder to explain. 2 days into the investigation, a tip comes in.
At about 2:30 p.m., the Schenectady Police Department gets a call from a person living 2.5 blocks from where the Lacys lived, saying that there was a car parked on a one-way street in front of their house, parked the wrong way.
There was a man sleeping in the car. The officers that responded made numerous attempts, pounding on the glass, knocking on the side of the car, and they felt that it was necessary to call for EMS.
They opened the door and tried to wake this person up. Not only was he obviously dead, he was nearly frozen.
They found no wallet, but they did find, by going through his pockets, an identification card. Then the police knew that this was Paul Lacy.
Paul Lacy was born May 12, 1964, in Albany, New York. He and his younger sister were part of a large extended family.
He was a loving brother. We always were watching cartoons. He used to take me to school. I was littler than him, so I walked slower, so I was pretty much led around, you know.
We had very strong mothers, and then it turned us into decent people.
Paul was always a happy kid. He always enjoyed life. Anything that he did, it was done because of his doing. What made him happy, that's what he did. Paul's father wasn't really in his life. I had to depend on the welfare system, but I was always going to take care of my kids.
After high school in the early 80s, Paul started working at a local market. He quickly rose to become a manager. It was also the place he met his future wife, Stella Close.
Stella and her family was in our neighborhood. Her dad was a hardworking man. Her mom was a stay-at-home mom, for what I could tell. So Stella had a stable home. She had dated a couple guys that were not as nice as Paul. He was nurturing and caring. He wanted to have somebody to love. She started coming around. And then next thing you know, they're getting married.
The young couple married in 1986. In the years that followed, Paul and Stella built a life together, including 3 beautiful children.
He decided to go into his career at Cargill, which is a flour mill at the Port of Albany.
Pretty much any job you got that was down at the Port of Albany, they paid you well.
Whatever his wife, Stella, wanted, he made it for her or got it for her. And it started with a car. Then he bought her a house, had a pool put in. He provided everything for that family.
And you know how it feels to not have a real father that you've been longing for. Therefore, you're going to be a stand-up man, and he decided to be that stand-up guy for his family.
Paul strove to be the best father he could be for his children, ages 9, 7, and 16 months.
Paul had 3 kids, a girl, a boy, a girl. That's what Paul wanted.
His heart was kind. He would always make sure whoever he did for, he was going to do his best by him. He didn't care who you was.
As far as Paul, his aspirations, each one was just a milestone. It became setting up for retirement, setting up for his children's education. So, yeah, his goals kept getting higher and higher.
But 2 days after Thanksgiving Day, 1995, Paul has been found deceased. At first glance, it's unclear how he died.
The keys were on the floor in the front seat. There was no broken glass anywhere. There His clothes weren't disheveled like there was a struggle. There was no blood. There was no gunshots. There was no knife wounds.
While there are no obvious wounds on Paul's body, closer inspection reveals a telltale sign of foul play.
He had at least 2 rounds of ligature marks around his neck. He was strangled.
There isn't much room in the back seat of this car, this Volvo. So it would have been very difficult for whoever killed Paul to have strangled him from the back seat.
That would tell me it took a person of size and or strength to pull this off, and that it wasn't done in his car, it was done elsewhere, and then Paul's body was moved from the actual crime scene.
Strangulation is not a typical means of death in a robbery case. People who strangle other people usually have a personal relationship. It could have been by someone who was close to him.
Coming up, investigators learn about a recent feud.
Paul put his foot down and said no. And then that's when the whole rage came out.
And a possible suspect shifts the course of the investigation.
I said, we'll get to the bottom of this. And with his hand, he pointed to the kitchen floor and said, the bottom starts right here.
Two days after Paul Lacy was reported missing, his dead body has been found less than 3 blocks away from home. And investigators are trying to determine why.
There was no jewelry on him at that time, although he was known to wear 3 rings, which he did not have on. His pockets and his black jeans were turned inside out. It could be construed as a robbery gone bad or a robbery/murder. And the fact that Stella said that he carried a large amount of money on him at all times would point to that fact for sure. The only thing that they found was a pager on his belt. They downloaded the pager information. Stella told the responding officers that she did try paging him and he didn't respond. So it pretty much corroborated Stella's story.
After assisting the forensics people from the state police, it was determined that the body was going to be removed from the vehicle and would be shipped for autopsy. Then, investigators made the notification right away.
We asked Stella to come to the police department. She was given what is essentially a death notification. She started crying, seemed very upset. When she settled down, we said, now you need to help us help you and find out what happened to Paul. She's traumatized at this point. We found her husband dead. She's got 3 children. If she makes a mistake in a statement, we're going to let it go. But we do find some inconsistencies with what she tells us versus what she told the responding patrolman to report him missing. She said she saw him eat a salami sandwich at 11:30, which she did not tell the responding officers initially. She also said that Paul came up to bed on Thanksgiving Eve and got in bed with her, that he wanted to have sex, but she turned him down. Even though there was inconsistencies, we have to take that into consideration. Emotions, finite details that she may or may not have forgotten. So we don't push her on that, because you don't want to paint her in a corner yet until we know more.
This time, when Stella describes the events leading up to Paul's disappearance, she leaves out mention of their neighbor Calvin. But she has another theory about who might be involved.
As far as she knew, he never cheated on her, and she stated she never cheated on him, other than some financial pressures that they were under. On the surface, they had a good marriage. But Stella said that he did have an ongoing feud with a first cousin by the name of David Womack, who actually lived with them for a few months.
His older cousin needed him, and he provided a place for him, where the other family members were like, no, you're not staying with us. Paul was the one that was kind-hearted.
Stella says the arrangement quickly turned sour. And on November 3rd, 3 weeks before Paul's body was discovered, the conflict between the cousins escalated.
David would get into these rage-type arguments, stuff like that. He always had guns and stuff. But Paul was not like that. Paul wasn't a physical fighter. David Womack had an issue with his anger. So he probably thought he could bully Paul and stay there. Well, Paul put his foot down and said no. Told him he had to go. And then that's when the whole rage came out.
Paul kicked him out of the house. And according to Paul Lacy, his cousin Dave Womack sliced tires on Paul's cars.
While David was never charged in the tire slashing incident, Paul's allegations pushed their relationship to a breaking point.
Paul Lacy kicked his cousin Womack out of the house, but he allowed another cousin, Ron Faulkner, to rent a room in the house.
Investigators tracked David down for an interview.
Of course, he denied any involvement and said he hadn't seen Paul in quite a while. And in fact, definitely he didn't see Paul Thanksgiving Eve or Thanksgiving.
David claims he went hunting with his sons on Thanksgiving Day.
That was corroborated by friends and family alike. Although he was very suspect at this point, his alibi was corroborated.
With David ruled out as a possible suspect, detectives hope Paul's autopsy will give them a new lead.
The ligature marks left bruising and a distinctive pattern around his neck.
The medical examiner had determined that, in fact, this was a homicide. It was further determined that Mr. Lacy had died by strangulation caused by ligature.
This is not an exact science in terms of time of death. The fact that Paul had been, quote unquote, frozen because of the weather and actually had been dead for some time, the ME cannot put, days on it. So we had to rely on the stomach contents and statement of Stella saying he ate a salami sandwich at 11:30 at night, Thanksgiving Eve. But Paul's stomach was empty, which would indicate that he hadn't eaten.
One of the last people to see him alive says that he is eating a sandwich or having a meal. The autopsy report is inconsistent with that. At this point, they're highly skeptical of those initial reports.
We still had a lot of unanswered questions. And now that Stella may or may not be involved, the pressure's on us to find other physical evidence or real evidence or eyewitnesses. But Paul's body was moved from the actual crime scene. Like, where did this actually happen?
Investigators have received Paul Lacy's autopsy report, which contradicts his wife Stella Lacy's story. But with little evidence to go on, police can't be certain of anything. They know the answers they seek likely depend on finding where the murder took place.
Well, how about his house? That's where he's supposed to be. And the last time Stella saw him, Getting a search warrant's a pretty heavy lift, and it takes time. So we asked Stella for consent to search. Paul's first cousin, Ron, who lived there, they both consented. There's investigators throughout the house, upstairs, downstairs, in bedrooms and bathrooms and closets, drawers, private places. And at one point, while I was there, a man just walked into the back door into the kitchen. Didn't knock. We nodded to each other, said hello, and he immediately went to the turkey, the Thanksgiving turkey, ripped off a leg, started eating it, and I said, who are you? And he said that he was a neighbor, identified himself as Calvin Smith.
Calvin Smith was another man who was in the house that night that Paul Lacy disappeared. Stella neglected to mention that Calvin was there in her second interview with the police.
He said, yeah, this is really sad about what happened to Paul. I said, yeah, but we'll get to the bottom of this. And with his hand, he pointed to the kitchen floor and said, the bottom starts right here. They certainly got my attention. I said, what do you mean by that? He shrugged his shoulders. He was just as calm, cool, and collected as could be. He's eating a leg off a turkey dinner. And I took note of that. And I said, something's up. More than meets the eye here. You know, again, it's common sense. The speculation is that it happened here. I didn't want to put a lot of pressure on him right then because we didn't know, was he involved? Was someone in the house involved? So I just let it go, but of course I told the rest of the team.
After concluding their search, investigators' suspicions are reinforced by another tip.
There was an anonymous call that came in that the origin was never identified, but indicated that Paul Lacy had very poor eyesight and needed to wear his glasses all the time.
After we got that phone call from a friend, we immediately, started thinking, where are the glasses? There were no glasses in the car. So that tells you pretty much that he didn't drive there where he was found.
At that point, investigation goes back to the last place where he was seen alive with his wife, Ron Faulkner, and Calvin Smith.
We decided that we need to talk to Ron, Calvin, and Stella for the third time and bring them into the police department to talk to individually. They weren't under arrest, but we had a plan. We're going to interview them separately and be able to pull apart their stories or corroborate their stories. If someone's lying, it's hard to keep up a lie, and one lie leads to another. The inconsistencies that may or may not have meant something early on come into focus a lot more when you add them up. One or all of them are involved, and it did happen in the house.
Coming up, detectives expose a marriage in distress.
She finally admits, I've been having an affair. In fact, Thanksgiving was our anniversary.
And a shocking confession turns the case upside down.
She said she stood there for a few minutes staring, and it dawned on her that Paul was dead.
On November 27, 1995, 2 days after Paul Lacy was found murdered in the backseat of his car, investigators attempt to verify his final moments with the 3 people who saw him last. Paul's wife, Stella Lacy, his friend Calvin Smith, and his cousin, Ronald Faulkner.
We start by interviewing Stella. I can tell that she's nervous now. She's got a whole different demeanor. And she knows that Ron and Calvin are being talked to in adjacent rooms.
Contrary to what she initially told police, Stella admits she and Paul were having problems.
The marriage wasn't as rosy as she initially painted a picture of, and that Paul always wanted sex, and that was something she wasn't willing to participate in as much as he wanted to. He was a free spender, and they had filed Chapter 13 to protect the house and their vehicles, but he was spending money, according to her, hand over fist.
Stella says she began spending more time with Paul's cousin, Ron.
Ron, took care of a lot of chores around the house, was Uncle Ron to the 3 kids.
She told police that Ron was a breath of fresh air and could talk to her and she could talk to him and he would listen, unlike Paul.
She finally admits, in fact, she says, I've been having an affair with Ron for about a year. In fact, Thanksgiving was our anniversary. I asked her if she loved Ron, and she said actually she didn't, but house-wise, it was a good thing for him to be there for babysitting, cleaning, chores, etc. But it was just like a convenience. In terms of motive, she's having an affair with Paul's first cousin, Ron, who's living in the home and had been there for about 6 or 7 months. Secondly, there's a money issue. And she finally admits that Paul had 2 life insurance policies worth $50,000.
Stella admits that over time, she and Ron began to fantasize about life without her husband.
She told me that both her and Ron disliked Paul and even hated him. And they talked about getting rid of Paul.
Stella said she never thought that was being taken seriously.
But Stella says on Thanksgiving Eve, Ron surprised her.
She went up to bed. Paul came up a short time after and got in bed, wanted to have sex with her. She turned him down, and they were in bed for the night. Within a few minutes, maybe 15 minutes or so, she said that Ron yelled upstairs.
Ron yelled up the stairs that Paul had a phone call, and he suggested Paul come down and take the call. According to Stella, he was only gone a few minutes, and then Ron went back up the stairs and asked Stella to come down.
She walked in the room and just saw Paul face down in Ron's bedroom with a blanket, a pink blanket over his head.
In the room besides Ron was Kelvin Smith, the neighbor that had been over to the house that evening. She said she stood there for a few minutes staring, and it dawned on her that Paul was dead.
They said, we got to get rid of him. She went back upstairs, got his shoes, pants, shirt, his belt, his pager, dressed him, all 3 of them, because it's not easy to dress a dead body. Calvin and Ron loaded Paul in the back seat of his Volvo. Stella said, I'll stay here and clean up the mess. She also said that Calvin had the rope they used to strangle him and told Calvin to get rid of the rope. And she told me that he flushed it down the toilet.
After they lowered Paul's body in the back seat, Ron drove the car, and he drove the car a couple of blocks away.
The 3 of them got together and said, here's what we're going to do. We'll make sure our stories match. And the biggest thing was that we're going to say it looked like a robbery. Here's Paul's 3 rings, which they removed from his hand after they killed him, and the money out of his pockets. Stella said, I'll wait till tomorrow to report Paul missing, and I'll beep him several times throughout the day so the police will think that I was really worried about him, that everything's going to be fine.
Stella's confession seems to explain everything, but detectives sense she is downplaying her involvement.
I don't know how true her confession is or not. I've got enough to believe that she's telling the truth to a point, but we need to talk to Ron and Calvin and put their stories together and see how close they are matching.
Coming up, the grisly details of the murder come to light.
He said, all right, I did it. I put the rope around his neck twice, and that was that.
And a confessed killer describes Paul's last moments.
He kisses Paul on the forehead and tells him, I'm sorry, but everyone can now be at peace.
New York authorities are investigating the strangulation death of Paul Lacy. While his wife, Stella Lacy, is naming her husband's cousin and neighbor in his murder, detectives are in other rooms with the two men trying to get their versions of the story.
I found out that Calvin was not admitting to anything, so I said, let me try. He denied being involved at all, so I asked him if he put his hands on the rope, and he said he did not. I said, Calvin, do you know what a rope is made of? And he kind of said, yeah, I guess. And I said, well, it's made of fibers. If you touch that rope, you're going to have these fibers embedded in your hand. Well, this is definitely not true, but Calvin seemed to be believing me. I told him that the PD had just purchased a fiber detection instrument. Now, this is 1995. Copy machines were brand new, big piece of equipment. Schenectady PD had purchased one recently, so I took him out of the interview room and I told him that was the fiber detection instrument. I lifted up the cover, as you would place a piece of paper there, and I said, we're going to stick your hand in that, and we're going to hit the detection button, or whatever I called it. And he put his hand down. You know, the bright light comes on. I said, don't look at the light. He pulled his hand away.
The investigator's ruse has the intended effect.
Right there at the copy machine, he said, all right, I did it. I strangled Paul. I put the rope around his neck twice, and that was that. I felt bad for Calvin that I had tricked him, but I can do that. I didn't interfere with his right to due process or convince an innocent person to confess something he didn't do, all within the guidelines of the law.
According to Calvin, Stella wasn't an innocent bystander. He says he went along with the murder because she promised to give him $100 up front, along with a cut from the insurance payout.
Stella said, I'm going to give you some money. He thought maybe this is life-changing money. They also took the rings off Paul's fingers.
Calvin thought he'd get a lot of money for those 3 rings, and instead, all he got for the total for the 3 rings was $40.
When they question Ron Faulkner, he confesses as well, but with a different motive than Calvin.
He was in love with Stella and wanted to end a toxic relationship in the marriage so that they could be together.
Ron knew that her relationship with Paul was not what she wanted.
Ron said he'd do anything to make Stella happy. So while he was out running errands with Paul and Calvin the night before Thanksgiving, he decided to make the fantasy a reality.
Ron said, here's what we're going to do. Calvin, you get the rope, because you're a big guy, and you can hide behind my bedroom door. I'm going to yell up to Paul. When he comes in, you put that rope around him twice and just pull as hard as you can. Which by Calvin's account and Ron's account, this is how it went down. Calvin just pulled as hard as he could for a couple minutes, and Ron actually jumped on top of Calvin to put more weight on Paul.
As he's dying, Ron leans forward, kisses Paul on the forehead, and tells him, "I'm sorry, but everyone can now be at peace."
Paul's body was found on Saturday, November 25th. 3 days later, Ron, Calvin, and Stella were arrested. All three were charged with murder, tampering with evidence, conspiracy.
While they all face the same charges, investigators believe Stella was the driving force behind the crime.
Stella, I think, manipulated them both into doing it. She was the puppet master.
I was shocked that Calvin, Ronald, and Stella had murdered my brother over insurance money with Stella. Anything she wanted, my brother would have gave it to her. It was senseless that she would even go to those extremes.
I couldn't imagine that type of betrayal, that type of pain that you would inflict on someone that you care about for money.
Paul's family relies on prosecutors to exact justice. But when it comes to Stella, they have major concerns.
Although I think Stella orchestrated this, it's hard for a jury to put someone away for life, even though they planned it. We have to make sure we did our job and the evidence is enough to take it to trial. You build the best case, because you're going to get one shot at this.
In August 1996, Stella Lacy goes on trial for the murder of her husband, Paul Lacy. Her alleged co-conspirators decide to take plea deals instead.
Ronald and Calvin, they were facing a potential death penalty case. And sure, their attorneys advised them that their only shot to save their own skin by pleading to the lesser murder charges rather than face potential death penalty.
Calvin pled guilty to first-degree murder, was sentenced to 25 to life. Ron decided to plead guilty to second-degree murder and also received 25 to life.
As part of his agreement, Calvin provides testimony against Stella. Prosecutors do not require the same of Ron.
He was in love with her and would never harm her.
Stella's demeanor during the trial was cold, very cold, stone-faced.
The defense strategy was that she did not participate in the murder, only became aware of it after the fact when Ron and Calvin notify her, and that her involvement was to help dispose of the body.
However, Calvin denies such claims. He testifies that Stella was the one that told him Paul's death needed to look like a robbery. He also claims that Stella wanted it to happen before the holiday.
Calvin indicated Stella had tried to do some pre-planning and that her representation that she was totally insulated from the actual homicide was incorrect.
Paul's cousin, David Womack, takes the stand as a witness. He testifies that Stella not only knew about the murder, she was the one who planned it.
His testimony was that he was approached by Stella and offered $10,000 to kill Paul.
Womack's statement shows that Stella had thought about this in advance.
But it doesn't seem to be enough for the jury.
Womack's credibility was terrible. He never reported to police that she had approached him, so, it looked like sour grapes on his part. The jury didn't believe his testimony. She was actually found not guilty of first-degree murder.
She was found guilty of criminally negligent homicide, tampering with evidence, and hindering prosecution.
She was sentenced 10 to 32 years in state prison.
The first reaction was upset, anger. We tried to let the justice system do their job, but it failed us.
I feel like Stella got a break. She should have did more time than anyone else because this was all her plan.
Of course, I was disappointed. I take that as a loss. We did our job. I think she manipulated this whole thing. The fact that she did not actually physically participate in the murder is tough, I think, for a jury to take it to the level to send her to prison for life.
Paul did not deserve to have his life taken away because of somebody's greed. He deserved better, and he didn't get that.
Paul had an infectious smile. He had a hug that would warm you to the bone. His generosity was unlimited. We still talk about him today. 30 years later, we keep him alive in our heart.
With Paul, it's like, I know he's safe. I don't have to worry about him. And that's the way I go forward with my life.
About by closest friends. And a profoundly strange coded messages Mark proudly posted on social media, claiming he was tracking her movements. Someone heavily manipulated Melissa Casillas that day. Someone violently made her deeply believe she had to disappear to protect her daughter. Or someone forced her hand into the ultimate shadow. The cold truth is remarkably patient. It does not magically decay like a fragile body in the high desert heat. It sits quietly and waits for a detective willing to ignore the pathetic smoke and mirrors. A detective who fundamentally knows that when a husband aggressively speaks ill of his missing wife, while the bed sheets are still reasonably warm, you are looking straight at the devil sitting comfortably in the living room. Humans are peculiar creatures. They kill for the most ridiculous reasons you can possibly imagine. I tell you, in my years working homicide, I have seen the darkest corners of the human soul, and it never ceases to amaze me how supposedly intelligent species can act out of sheer, primitive malice. Our story begins in the small town of Winnsboro, Texas, a place where everyone knows your name, your family, and your business. Winnsboro is the kind of place where people leave their doors unlocked at night. That is a beautiful sentiment, until the devil realizes the door is wide open. On May 4th, 2007, 19-year-old Brittany McGlone learned that lesson in the most tragic way possible. Brittany was a good kid. She worked an overnight shift at a distribution center and held a second job at a local discount store. She was exhausting her own body, pushing herself to the absolute limit, trying to save up enough money for nursing school. She wanted to heal people. She wanted a future. Her inner world was filled with quiet ambition, driven by the pure desire to build something solid and respectable out of her youth. But predators do not care about your dreams. They only care about your vulnerability. After finishing a grueling overnight shift, instead of going straight home to her own bed, she broke her routine. She went to home of her boyfriend, a young man named Jeff. She simply wanted to spend a few quiet moments with him before he had to leave for the day to pick up his grandmother. By 9 o'clock in the morning, Jeff and his stepfather left the house, leaving Brittany sound asleep. Sleep is the one time we surrender ourselves completely to the universe. We trust the walls around us to keep the monsters at bay. Fast forward to 3:30 in the afternoon. Brittany is not answering her telephone. Her mother, Patricia, feels that cold, heavy dread settling in the pit of her stomach. A mother always knows when the world has tilted off its axis. Jeff returns home, walks into his bedroom, and his world ends. Brittany is dead. She is completely naked. The room is painted with violence, displaying the kind of cast-off blood spatter that tells me someone swung a heavy, blunt object with immense fury. Yet, the weapon is nowhere to be found. The killer took it with them. But they left something else behind. The killer took a shower in that very house. My, you have a young woman brutally beaten to death in a bed, and the monster responsible is so devoid of human empathy, so utterly arrogant and cold, that he calmly steps into the adjacent bathroom, turns on the water, and washes the evidence of his sins down the drain, while his victim lies dead just a few feet away. This tells me volumes about the psychology of our suspect. This is not a panic burglar who made a mistake. This is a calculated predator who feels completely comfortable in that environment. Someone who believes they are entirely untouchable. In homicide, you always look at the person who shares the bed first. We look at the boyfriend, Jeff. But Jeff has an alibi. A solid one, backed by video surveillance from a convenience store miles away. We look at a dark family secret involving a grandfather, but his time cards at work clear him completely. Then, a shadow emerges from the periphery of this family. A 25-year-old man named Chad Carr. Chad is dating the teenage sister of Jeff. He is a grown man hanging around a high school girl, which already tells me his emotional maturity is severely stunted, and his moral compass is fundamentally broken. Chad admits he stopped by the house around 8:30 that morning to get something for his teenage girlfriend. He knew Brittany was there. He knew she was alone and asleep. The investigators begin to pull on this thread, and the entire world of the suspect starts to unravel. He gives a detailed timeline of his day, a timeline so intricate, so overly explained, that it reeks of rehearsed deception. Innocent people do not remember every single minute of a random Tuesday unless they are desperately trying to hide the 1 hour they committed a murder. Between 9:21 in the morning and 10:20 in the morning, Chad is unaccounted for. He claims he went home to change clothes because of the weather. You have to be kidding me. The weather that morning was exceptionally mild, sitting in the upper 60s. He did not change clothes because he was warm. He changed clothes because he was soaked in the blood of an innocent 19-year-old girl. The arrogance of this man is simply staggering. When questioned, Chad tries to play the victim of circumstance. But we dig into his past, and the past never stays buried. In 2001, Chad was involved in a vicious attack on a woman named Debbie. He waited until she was alone in a small trailer, cornered her, and struck her in the head with a heavy red jackhandle. He panicked that time and made excuses. But predators learn from their mistakes. They refine their brutal craft. Chad learned that blunt force trauma is effective, and by 2007, he had evolved into a killer who makes sure the victim cannot talk back. The psychological profile here is glaringly obvious. Chad is a man who harbors a deep, simmering rage. He is a man who cannot succeed in the daylight. A man who feels small, insignificant, and powerless in the eyes of society. So, how does a coward make himself feel big? He finds someone weaker. He stalks the shadows of a house he has no business being in. He views women not as human beings with souls and aspirations, but as objects to be controlled, dominated, and destroyed when they are most defenseless. We look closer at the behavioral evidence. His teenage girlfriend notices he smells distinctly of her specific shea butter body wash when he picks her up that afternoon. Why would he smell like that? Because he used it in her shower after he slaughtered a girl in the next room. Police execute a search warrant and find size 5 white women's underwear in his residence. Brittany wore a size 5, and her underwear was missing from the crime scene. Yet, when confronted with the reality that investigators are testing for genetic evidence, Chad preemptively declares to the authorities that his genetic material will not be found on that girl or in that room. Innocent men do not speak like that. Guilty men who think they have scrubbed a crime scene clean say things like that. He is taunting the police. He is sitting in an interrogation room, dripping with fake innocence, truly believing his own lies. It makes me sick to my stomach. But justice in this world is a flawed and fragile machine. In 2022, a new sheriff with a real backbone finally slaps handcuffs on Chad Carr. They charge him with capital murder, but the legal system falters. A grand jury fails to indict him, returning a no bill. Chad walks out a free man, a smug grin likely plastered across his face as he steps back into the sunlight. But let me tell you something about cold cases and homicide detectives. We do not forget. We are extraordinarily patient. We sit in the dark and we wait for the arrogant to make one final, fatal mistake. Brittany McGlone was a bright light in a dark world, a hard-working girl whose life was stolen by a pathetic, violent coward who could only strike when she was sleeping peacefully. Her family waits in agony, holding on to the faded memories of a daughter who deserved a long, beautiful life. And the man who took that life might be walking the streets today, breathing free air, but his soul is already condemned. We will keep looking. We will keep testing the evidence. Because in the end, the truth is a relentless hound, and no matter how fast or how far you run, it will eventually catch you. Humans are strange creatures. They kill for the most ridiculous reasons you can possibly imagine, and they lie with the clumsiness of a toddler holding an empty cookie jar. I tell you, when you have sat across from enough of these individuals, you start to realize that the criminal mind is rarely a masterpiece of dark genius. It is usually a chaotic mess of greed, cowardice, and profound stupidity. Take a night in late November the year 2016. The town is Benson, North Carolina. It is around 3 a.m, a time when honest people are asleep and the devil is just finishing his shift. 2 men, Julian Valles Jr. and Jeremy Carpenter, stroll up to police officers in a parking lot. They do not look panicked. They just need a locksmith. They claim their friend, a 22-year-old kid named Christopher Cole Thomas, got paranoid pulled. The car overtook the keys and vanished into the dark. My, you have to be kidding me. You expect me to believe a young man from Florida stranded in a town he does not know just sprinted into the abyss for absolutely no reason, while his so-called friends just shrug their shoulders and worry about getting back to their construction jobs in Minnesota. That is the kind of bold-faced lie that insults the intelligence of everyone in the room. Cole was not just some wanderer. He was a smart kid of salutatorian, a young man who wanted to go into medicine to help his autistic brother. He was taking a break, working with his hands, trying to figure out this complicated world. He trusted these men, and that was his first and final mistake. What these fools did not bother to tell the police or the parents of Cole was that this was no innocent Thanksgiving road trip. It was a cross-country run for methamphetamine. Julian and Jeremy were not looking for turkey. They were looking for a high and a quick buck. The truth only began to bleed out when the father of Cole, sensing the terrifying silence of his son, tracked down a co-worker named Stephen, who spilled the darkest secret a parent could hear telling. Him, he thought the boys killed Cole. The parents drive through the night from Florida, their hearts shattered, fueled by that primal instinct to protect their child. And what do the police find when they press these amateur hour criminals? The story bends. It always bends. They admit to the drug deal over in Mount Olive with a couple of local heavyweights named Rudy and TJ. They claim Cole panicked on the drive back. But a brilliant investigator named Percy spent night after agonizing night scouring surveillance footage until he found a ghost in the machine. At exactly 1:10 in the morning on a grainy camera behind a Walgreens, there is Cole walking in the dark, and right behind him, trailing like the Grim Reaper, is Jeremy. You see, the lies were unraveling. Confronted with this, Jeremy spins another yarn, claiming they went to a church he kneeled to pray for. His diabetes in his soul, and when he opened his eyes, Cole was gone, replaced by the ominous sound of a slamming car door. I tell you, if I had a nickel for every time a suspect suddenly found religion when the handcuffs started clinking, I would be a very wealthy man. The digital footprint, however, does not pray, and it does not lie. The cell phone data mapped out a conspiracy of cowards. The phones moved together from Mount Olive to Benson, stopped where Cole allegedly ran, and then, inexplicably, the phone of Cole began moving again with the others after he supposedly vanished. Why would a fleeing man leave his phone, and why would his friends take it with them as they met up with the very dealers they were supposedly running from, turning it off just after 4 in the morning? The working theory pieced together by a private investigator named David Marshburn, who had to wade through the murky waters of death threats, reveals the tragic psychology of a double cross gone horribly wrong. Julian likely planned to buy the meth and then steal it back, keeping the product and the cash. But Julian made a fatal miscalculation about the young man behind the wheel. Cole was a pre-med student who spoke fluent Spanish. In the claustrophobic confines of that car, surrounded by greedy men whispering their treacherous plans, Cole understood every word. He realized he was the unwitting getaway driver for a suicide mission. The panic was real. The terror was justified. In ensuing chaos, drugs were tossed out the window. The plan imploded, and the wolves turned on the sheep. They needed a scapegoat for the missing narcotics, and the smart kid from Florida was a perfect sacrifice. The dealers called in a thug named Gordo, who admitted to hunting Cole down and throwing him into a vehicle, possibly disorienting him with a baseball bat. They shattered the future of a bright, compassionate young man over bags of cheap poison. The emotional agony inflicted on the parents of Cole is immeasurable to know their boy suffered in. His final moments surrounded by strangers who viewed his life as collateral damage. Even when the father of Cole took the astonishing, heartbreaking risk of bailing TJ out of jail just to appeal to his humanity, just to beg for the location of the body of his son, he was met with cowardice. These men sat in interrogation rooms and gave fractions of truth, protecting their own miserable hides while a family drowned in grief. The obstruction charges were eventually dropped to preserve a future homicide case, and Jeremy took his secrets to the grave in the year 2024. But the data remains. The silence of Wayne County speaks volumes. Someone knows exactly where Christopher Cole Thomas is buried. Someone is waking up every single morning with the ghost of a 22-year-old boy standing at the foot of their bed. Humans are strange creatures indeed. They think a secret buried in the dirt will stay there forever. But the truth has a funny way of clawing its way back to the surface, and when it does, no amount of lies, no fabricated prayers in a church parking lot will save them from the reckoning that is coming. If anyone holds the final piece of this puzzle, they need to call the Benson Police Department at 919-894-2091 or the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation at 919-779-8188 before the data finishes telling the story. They were too cowardly to confess. Human beings are strange creatures. They will run from their own shadows only to walk right into the mouth of a wolf. They kill for the most absurd reasons you could possibly imagine, and they look for fresh starts in the most desolate places on earth, dragging their demons right along with them. My name is Joe Kenda. I spent over 2 decades working homicide, and I tell you, some cases do not just leave a file on your desk. They leave a stain on your soul. This is one of them. The date is October 17th, 2009. We are in Latimer County, Oklahoma, an unforgiving stretch of rugged terrain where people go to disappear. A local sheriff gets a call about an abandoned truck sitting on a narrow dirt road on Panola Mountain. When deputies arrive, they find the vehicle locked tight. Inside is a small dog, emaciated, starved, and barely clinging to life. You have to be kidding me. Who leaves a helpless animal to die in a steel box? That right there's your first indisputable clue that whatever happened on that mountain was not a planned vacation. It was a sudden and violent interruption of daily life. The deputies break the glass to save the animal and look inside the cabin. What do they find? The keys are still sitting in the ignition. Winter coats are left behind. A cellular telephone equipped with a global positioning system is resting on the console. Identification cards belonging to Bobby and Sherilyn Jameson are present. And tucked carefully beneath the seat is $32,000 in cold, hard cash. My. I have interviewed thousands of criminals and victims in my career, and I can assure you of one universal truth. People who are planning to walk into the woods and end their own lives do not carefully hide $2,000 under a seat before they do it. Then the deputies find a letter. It is 7 pages long, filled with pure, unadulterated venom. Sherilyn writing to her husband, Bobby. She calls him a monster. She accuses him of beating her so hard he nearly broke her spine. She talks about demons and God and spiritual warfare. When you read a document like that, you are not just reading words on a page. You are looking directly into the mind of someone who is deeply and tragically fractured. Sherilyn was fighting a war inside her own head. She suffered from bipolar disorder, deep depression, and severe attention deficits. We know she had stopped taking her psychiatric medication. When a person does that, the world warps around them. Shadows become physical threats. But a bitter letter does not equal a murderer. It merely equals a miserable and broken marriage. Let's examine who these people actually were. Bobby Jameson was a man ruined by a severe automobile collision. His back was destroyed, leaving him in chronic agony. He turned to prescription pain medication to survive the day, and as it always happens, the pill soon became his master. Sherilyn joined him in that dark place. They were 2 drowning people holding on to each other, pulling each other straight down to the bottom. And caught in the middle of this whirlpool was a beautiful 6-year-old little girl named Madison. That is the part that breaks my worry. Upon entering the apartment, Officer Weller was met with a scene that initially pointed to a burglary. The living room was in a state of disarray, with compact discs scattered across the floor and furniture displaced. He called out into the quiet rooms, but his voice returned only silence. He checked the kitchen and the bathroom, finding them empty, before turning his attention to the master bedroom. Initially, the bedroom appeared vacant, and the officer prepared to step back outside to reassure the waiting family. But as he turned toward the exit, his flashlight illuminated faint hand smudges on the wall adjacent to a small closet. A sudden, heavy hesitation took hold of him, an instinct telling him that something terrible lay behind that door. Steeling himself, he opened the closet. Inside, he discovered the bodies of Long Gwyn and Hong Lu. They had been bound tightly with duct tape, their heads and mouths completely wrapped, and a small space bore the unmistakable signs of a violent struggle. In shock, Officer Weller stepped out of the bedroom, momentarily unable to speak or use his radio. When he finally regained his composure, he requested immediate assistance from crime scene investigators and homicide detectives. Detective Stewart, a veteran with 21 years of experience in the homicide unit, arrived shortly after. He was deeply shaken by the sheer cruelty inflicted upon an elderly, defenseless couple who had no known enemies and were beloved by everyone in the community. At first glance, the scene appeared to be a robbery gone terribly wrong, but several details struck the detectives as highly unusual. On the coffee table lay a plate of crushed prescription pills and a discarded marijuana cigarette, as if the intruders had paused to consume drugs. More peculiarly, a light blue bandana was wrapped carefully around a beer bottle, left in plain sight. In Arlington, Certain active youth gangs were known to associate with specific colors, and the blue bandana seemed like an explicit calling card. Yet, Detective Stewart was skeptical. The scene felt too staged, the clues too perfect, as if someone had deliberately tried to paint a picture of gang violence to steer the investigation away from the truth. As the forensic teams collected hair fibers, blood swabs, and the duct tape for fingerprint and deoxyribonucleic acid testing, investigators began interviewing the family. Chow Tran, speaking as the primary representative because of his English fluency, explained that the family had gathered the previous evening to celebrate his father-in-law's birthday. The elderly couple had enjoyed themselves immensely, leaving the celebration around 10:30 in the evening with a ride from another relative. It was the last time they were seen alive. Chow mentioned that while the sewing business was struggling, his in-laws did not keep significant amount of cash at home, as they had been facing severe financial stress. The following day, detectives attended the autopsy at the Tarrant County Medical Examiner's office. The findings were heartbreaking. While the victims had suffered blunt force trauma to their heads, likely from an object resembling a hammer or a small bat, that was not the cause of their passing. Hong Lee's face had been wrapped in 25 feet of duct tape and Long Wen's in 10 feet. They had succumbed to suffocation. The cold, calculated nature of their deaths confirmed to Detective Stewart that this was not a simple robbery. The explicit intent of the perpetrators was to end the lives of the gentle couple. The investigation took a sudden turn when Detective Stewart received a routine inquiry from an insurance company. It revealed that the deceased couple held a substantial life insurance policy valued at least $1 million. When detectives questioned the insurance company regarding the beneficiaries, they discovered that Chow Tran was among those set to receive the funds. On June 13, 2012, investigators invited Chow back to the station. He explained that the policy was intended to ensure the survival of the family business should anything happen to the elders. He provided a detailed timeline of his whereabouts on the night of the crime, confirming he was playing cards with relatives until past 10 in the evening. With airtight family alibis and no immediate forensic matches from the crime scene, the investigation began to slow. The genetic profiles recovered from the marijuana cigarette did not match any family members, nor did they find a match in the Federal Bureau of Investigation's combined DNA index system. For more than 2 years, the case remained cold, leaving the detectives frustrated but determined. Then, in October of 2015, a breakthrough emerged from an entirely unexpected source. A 19-year-old named Willie Guillory was arrested in Houston for felony of horse theft. Because he was now an adult facing a felony charge, his genetic profile was entered into the national database. To the astonishment of the Arlington detectives, Willie's profile was an exact match for the deoxyribonucleic acid found on the marijuana cigarette, left at the crime scene in 2012. At the time of the murders, Willie had been only 16 years old, which explained why his profile had not previously been in the system. On October 17, 2015, investigators brought Willie Guillory in for questioning. When confronted with the scientific evidence linking him to the apartment, the young man broke down in tears and confessed. He revealed that he had not acted alone. He had been led to Arlington by his 49-year-old uncle, Bobby Guillory. Willie explained that on June 9, 2012, they made the 3-hour drive from Houston, armed with a key to the apartment. Their instructions were to stage a burglary, leaving behind beer bottles, pills, and the blue bandana to mimic gang activity. When the elderly couple returned home, a struggle ensued, ending in the closet where they were ultimately left. When asked why they had targeted the sweet couple, Willie revealed a shocking truth. It was a murder-for-hire plot orchestrated by Daphne Wright, the spiritual advisor. Daphne had complained that the family owed her a vast sum of money and wanted them to pay. She had promised Bobby Guillory $10,000 to carry out the deed, exploiting his financial desperation after he had been laid off from his job. With this confession, the police arrested Bobby Guillory on December 16th, 2015. Bobby soon confessed as well, pointing the finger back to Daphne Wright as the mastermind. But Bobby added a chilling detail that blindsided detectives. When asked how Daphne had obtained the key to the apartment, Bobby claimed she had received it directly from Chow Tran. On August 31st, 2016, detectives traveled to Houston to confront Daphne Wright. Inside her home, they discovered a detailed ledger revealing that she charged clients tens of thousands of dollars for her spiritual services. Despite her cold exterior and refusal to cooperate, investigators obtained an arrest warrant. In exchange for his testimony against Daphne, Bobby, and Willie, prosecutors offered Chow Tran immunity. Chow claimed that he and his mother-in-law had been terrified of Daphne's alleged spiritual powers, believing she could place a terrible curse on their family if they did not pay. According to Chow, Hong Lu had even suggested sacrificing herself so the family could collect the insurance money to pay the debt, while investigators found the notion of a voluntary sacrifice highly improbable. They knew they needed Chow's testimony to convict the true instigator. The trial of Daphne Wright began on August 26, 2019. Chow took the stand, portraying Daphne as a ruthless, greedy individual who would stop at nothing to secure her money. The defense argued that Chow was the true beneficiary of the tragedy, having received the $850,000 insurance payout, and had used Daphne as a scapegoat. Nevertheless, in September of 2019, the jury found Daphne Wright guilty of capital murder, sentencing her to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Willie and Bobby Guillory also faced justice for their roles in the tragedy, though the detectives felt a lingering sadness that Chow Tran did not face legal consequences. The resolution of the case brought a profound sense of closure to the community, proving that even the darkest secrets eventually come to light, and that the memory of Long and Hong's gentle spirits would live on, honored by the justice finally served. The morning sun over Arlington, Texas, always seemed to carry a certain promise, especially for those who had traveled across oceans to find it. In the year 2000, Long Nguyen and his beloved wife, Hong Le, arrived in the United States from Vietnam, bringing with them not just their 3 children, but a lifetime of hopes, quiet determination, and the rich traditions of their homeland. Arlington was a bustling city in Tarrant County, a vibrant melting pot where the old world and the new world met in harmony. For the large Vietnamese community that had flourished there since the late 70s, it was a sanctuary of opportunity, a place where hard work could transform a simple life into a beautiful legacy. Long and Hong were gentle, warm-hearted souls who smiled easily and spoke with a quiet humility that instantly endeared them to everyone they met. They established a commercial sewing business, pouring their hearts into every stitch, every roll of fabric, and every finished garment. To help navigate the complex landscape of American commerce, they relied on their son-in-law, Chow Tran, a 38-year-old immigrant who spoke English fluently and became the public face of their family enterprise. For nearly a decade, their efforts bore sweet fruit, culminating in a highly lucrative contract to manufacture garments for a global entertainment giant, an achievement that felt like the ultimate realization of their American dream. However, the tide of fortune is as unpredictable as the ocean. By the year 2011, the family faced a sudden and challenging shift when their major commercial contract came to an end. The sewing machines, which had once hummed with prosperous energy, grew quiet, and the weight of financial stress began to settle over the household. In times of difficulty, humans often look backward to the ancient roots of their culture for comfort and guidance. For generations, many families in their homeland believed in the spiritual alignment of energy, the protection of traditional deities, and the delicate balance of luck. When conventional methods failed to restore their business, Hong and Chow began to wonder if a spiritual cloud had cast a shadow over their endeavors. They searched the local Vietnamese newspapers for a guide, a spiritual advisor who could offer hope, perform traditional rituals, and lift the heavy burden of what they feared was a business curse. That search led them to Houston, 250 miles away, where a woman named Daphne Wright advertised her services as a spiritual counselor capable of removing obstacles and restoring prosperity. Chow Tran made the long journey to Houston to meet Daphne, hopeful that her ancient practices could breathe life back into the family business. At first, the rituals brought a sense of comfort and a renewal of hope. Daphne was a commanding, direct woman who exuded absolute confidence in her spiritual authority. But as the months rolled on, the promised prosperity remained elusive, while the financial demands for Daphne's elaborate ceremonies began to escalate dramatically. What began as a simple consultation turned into a spiraling cycle of spiritual debt. Because the family was desperate to salvage their dream, Chow continued to authorize rituals on credit, and the outstanding balance soon ballooned to an astronomical sum between $250,000 and $280,000. To a family already struggling to keep their business afloat, this was an unimaginable fortune, a debt that felt like a trap from which they could never escape. The morning of June 10, 2012, broke with an eerie quietness. At 7:29 in the morning, emergency dispatchers received a worried call from Chow Tran, requesting a welfare check on his elderly in-laws. He explained that his family had gathered outside the couple's apartment, deeply concerned because they had not heard from them and noticed that one of the windows was unusually open. Officer Weller, a dedicated officer with 14 years of experience, was the first to arrive on the scene. He noted the anxious family waiting outside, a sight that immediately signaled this was no ordinary welfare check. Upon entering the apartment, Officer Weller observed a home in disarray, showing the classic signs of a sudden disturbance. He systematically checked the living room, the kitchen, and the bathroom, finding no one. Entering the bedroom, he initially thought the apartment was empty, but as he turned to leave, his flashlight caught faint smudges on the wall next to a small utility closet. Trusting his professional instincts, he opened the door and made a somber, tragic discovery. Inside the closet lay Long and Hong, the elderly couple who had spent their lives seeking peace and building a future for their family, had been bound with duct tape and had tragically passed away. The scene was deeply affecting, leaving even a veteran force shaken by the loss of two gentle community members. Arlington homicide investigators, including Detective Stewart, a seasoned investigator with 21 years of experience, arrived to piece together the mystery. At first glance, the apartment suggested a robbery gone wrong, but several peculiar items caught the detective's attention. On the coffee table lay a plate of crushed prescription pills and a marijuana cigarette, and most curiously, a light blue bandana was wrapped carefully around a beer bottle, almost as if it had been left intentionally as a calling card. To the experienced detectives, the scene felt almost too orchestrated, leading them to suspect that someone had deliberately tried to stage the crime to look like gang activity, shifting the focus away from the true perpetrator. As the community mourned the loss of Long and Hong, detectives attended the autopsy, where they learned the heartbreaking truth that the couple had suffocated due to the restrictive tape. The sheer deliberation of the act made it clear that this was not a random act of violence, but a targeted, deeply personal crime. While investigating potential motives, Detective Stewart received a phone call from an insurance company, revealing that the couple possessed a highly substantial life insurance policy worth at least $1 million, with Chow Tran listed as a beneficiary. When questioned on June 13, 2012, Chow cooperated fully, explaining that the policy was designed to protect and sustain the commercial sewing business in the event of a tragedy. He and his family provided airtight alibis, demonstrating they had been celebrating his father-in-law's birthday together at a gathering until late the previous evening. DNA samples and fingerprints were gathered from the family and compared against the evidence left at the scene, including the marijuana cigarette, but no matches were found in the federal database, and the case gradually grew cold, leaving the family to pick up the pieces of their broken lives. 3 years passed in quiet reflection until October 12, 2015, when a surprising breakthrough occurred. A young man named Willie Guillory, who had been 16 years old at the time of the tragedy, was arrested as an adult for an unrelated felony involving horse theft in Houston. Because of his new adult felony conviction, his DNA profile was entered into the national database for the first time, triggering an immediate and perfect match with the DNA found on the marijuana cigarette at the Arlington crime scene. On October 17, 2015, Willie was brought in for questioning. When presented with the scientific evidence of his presence in the apartment, the young man broke down in tears and confessed, revealing that he had not acted alone. He explained that his uncle, Bobby Guillory, a 49-year-old man with no prior criminal record, had recruited him to travel to Arlington to perform a task for a woman named Daphne Wright, whom they met through a family acquaintance. Willie explained that Daphne had been furious about a massive unpaid debt and wanted the couple dealt with. She had provided Bobby with a key to the apartment to facilitate entry, and the plan was to stage a robbery using gang symbols to mislead the police. Guided by this confession, detectives traveled to Katy, Texas, on December 2015, to arrest Bobby Guillory. Confronted with the reality of the investigation, Bobby also confessed, expressing deep remorse and fear. He admitted that Daphne had promised him $10,000 to carry out the deed, capitalizing on a severe financial desperation after being laid off from his job. Bobby painted a vivid picture of Daphne Wright as a spiritual loan shark who ran her household and her business with an iron fist, demanding payment from her clients by any means necessary. In a startling revelation, Bobby told investigators that Daphne had acquired the apartment key directly from Chow Tran. This accusation of internal betrayal shocked the detectives, who had spent years supporting the family through their grief. Financial investigations into Chow Tran's records revealed that after the tragedy, the sewing business had folded, a new home had been purchased, and Chow had avoided further communication with the police. Faced with the mounting evidence, prosecutors offered Chow immunity in exchange for his complete and honest testimony, recognizing that his cooperation was essential to secure justice against the true instigator of the plot, Daphne Wright. During the trial in August of the year 2019, Chow Tran testified before a jury, describing the immense psychological pressure and fear that Daphne had exerted over his family. He claimed that his mother-in-law, Hong, out of deep cultural desperation and a desire to protect her family from what she believed was a devastating spiritual curse, had tragically suggested sacrificing herself so the family could collect the insurance money to satisfy the debt. Daphne had seized upon the idea, demanding that both elders be eliminated to cover the full balance. Chow admitted to leaving the key under a mat for Daphne, who then passed it to Bobby Guillory. In September of 2019, the jury delivered their verdict, convicting Daphne Wright of capital murder and sentencing her to life in prison without the possibility of parole. While the resolution left some questions about individual accountability unanswered, it brought a profound sense of closure to the community, serving as a powerful educational lesson about the dangers of extreme superstition and the ultimate triumph of truth, resilience, and justice over deception. The morning sun rose over Arlington, Texas, casting a warm, golden glow across the quiet suburban neighborhoods. It was a city built on the promises of tomorrow, a sprawling community in Tarrant County where diverse cultures walked hand in hand, sharing their dreams under the vast Texas sky. Among those who found a haven here was a vibrant Vietnamese community. The first wave of families had arrived after the historic events of 1975, bringing with them a rich heritage, an enduring work ethic, and an unwavering belief in the promise of their new homeland. They adapted to their new surroundings with grace, opening businesses, raising families, and weaving their traditions into the very fabric of the city. Among the most beloved members of this community were Long Nguyen and his gentle wife, Hong Lu, having immigrated to the United States in the year 2000. They brought with them their 3 cherished children and a heart full of hope. They were a prominent and respected family, known throughout the area for their kindness, their generosity, and their gentle spirits. To know them was to respect them. They never bothered anyone, always offering a warm smile or a helping hand to those in need. For them, family was the ultimate treasure, and their dream was to build a lasting legacy that would support their children and grandchildren for generations to come. Upon arriving in Texas, Long and Hong established a commercial sewing business. It was a true family endeavor. They poured their hearts into the enterprise, working long hours over humming sewing machines. Surrounded by colorful rolls of fabric and the sweet scent of jasmine tea, to bridge the gap between their traditional ways and the fast-paced American business world, they enlisted the help of their son-in-law, Chow Tran. At 38 years old, Chow was charismatic, articulate, and spoke fluent English. He became the public face of the business, managing relations with contractors, signing agreements, and handling the daily negotiations. For nearly a decade, their dedication bore fruit. The American dream felt tangibly close when they secured a highly lucrative contract to manufacture garments for a global entertainment giant, producing beautiful items that brought joy to families across the country. Their workshop was a place of laughter and shared industry. However, by the year 2011, the winds of fortune began to shift. The prestigious contract was lost, and the global economic tides turned against their small business. The steady stream of orders slowed to a trickle, and the family found themselves facing mounting financial pressures. In times of great hardship, it is human nature to look toward one's roots for guidance and comfort. For generations, traditional beliefs had held that the universe operates on delicate balances of energy, luck, and spiritual protection. Many believed that during times of immense struggle, such as impending bankruptcy or personal crisis, a spiritual advisor could offer prayers and rituals to lift curses and restore harmony. Seeking a way to turn their fortunes around, Chow Tran and his mother-in-law, Hong, searched through a local Vietnamese newspaper. There, they found an advertisement for a spiritual advisor located 250 miles away in the bustling city of Houston. The advertisement promised a path to renewal, claiming the advisor possessed the spiritual power to remove negative energy, lift deep-seated curses, and attract abundant good fortune. Encouraged by Hong's deep-seated beliefs, Chow reached out to the spiritual guide, a woman named Daphne Wright. Daphne agreed to meet them at her Houston residence for a consultation. Hoping to rescue their beloved sewing business, Chow traveled to Houston. The atmosphere was thick with incense and the soft chime of bells as Daphne performed a traditional ritual designed to invite prosperity back into their lives. The family returned to Arlington filled with renewed hope, believing that their dark days would soon be behind them. Yet a year later, the promised turn of fortune had not arrived. Instead, a quiet shadow fell over the family. On the morning of June 10th, 2012, at exactly 7:29 in the morning, an emergency dispatcher in Arlington received a distress call from Chow Tran. He requested a welfare check on his elderly in-laws, explaining that his family had gathered outside the couple's apartment and felt a deep, unsettling anxiety. Chow explained that his teenage son had gone to knock on the door, but there had been no answer. The family noticed that a window to the residence was slightly open, and things simply did not look right. Too frightened to enter the apartment themselves, they waited anxiously on the sidewalk, praying for reassurance. Officer Weller, a compassionate and dedicated responding officer, was quickly dispatched to the scene. Arriving at the apartment complex, Weller immediately noted that this was not a typical welfare check. An entire family stood outside in the early morning light, their faces etched with worry. Upon entering the apartment, the officer called out, but only silence answered. The living room appeared to be in disarray, with items scattered as if a burglary had taken place. Weller checked the kitchen and the bathroom, finding them empty before turning toward the sole remaining room, the bedroom. With a flashlight in hand, the officer surveyed the quiet bedroom. Initially, nothing seemed out of the ordinary, and Weller felt a brief wave of relief, hoping the elderly couple had simply gone for an early morning walk. But as the officer turned to leave, the beam of the flashlight caught faint hand smudges on the wall next to a very small closet door. A sudden instinct urged caution, but duty demanded thoroughness. Officer Weller gently opened the closet door. Inside the small space lay Long and Hong, bound tightly with heavy gray tape. There was no breath left in them, and the scene spoke of a tragic, sudden end. Overcome by the weight of the discovery, Officer Weller walked back to the living room, pausing to collect composure before calling for a supervisor and the crime scene unit. Arlington homicide investigators, including seasoned detectives with over 2 decades of experience, soon arrived to process the scene. It was clear that a violent struggle had occurred. There were marks of disturbance near the front entrance, and the living room had been ransacked, with compact discs and household items strewn across the floor. On the coffee table lay a plate with crushed prescription tablets and a hand-rolled cigarette, alongside a light blue bandana wrapped around a glass bottle. To the initial observer, these items seemed like the calling cards of local youth gangs who were known to occasionally trouble the area. However, experienced detectives knew that sometimes things can appear too perfect. The presence of the gang-related items felt staged, as if someone had deliberately tried to paint a picture of a random robbery gone wrong. While forensic experts carefully collected the hand-rolled cigarette, hair fibers, and taped the search for genetic markers, detectives turned their attention to supporting the grieving family. Chow Tran, speaking on behalf of the family, met with Detective Stewart. He explained that the family had gathered the previous evening to celebrate his father-in-law's birthday. The elderly couple had enjoyed a wonderful evening, staying until 10 o'clock before receiving a ride home from another family member. Chow painted a picture of a sweet, hard-working couple who had no known enemies. When asked about financial matters, Chow mentioned that while traditional families sometimes kept savings at home, his in-laws did not possess significant wealth, as the sewing business had continued to struggle. An autopsy conducted by the Tarrant County Medical Examiner confirmed a heartbreaking reality. The couple had not perished from physical trauma, but rather from suffocation due to the extensive wrapping of tape around their faces. The tragedy touched the hearts of the investigators, strengthening their resolve to bring those responsible to justice. A routine notification from an insurance company soon introduced a new element to the investigation. The detectives learned that the deceased couple carried life insurance policies totaling a very substantial amount, reaching toward $1 million, with Chow Tran named as a primary beneficiary. When gently questioned about this, Chow explained that the policies had been established to ensure the survival of the family business and the security of the children in the event of an untimely tragedy. He provided a detailed timeline of his whereabouts on the night of the event, explaining that he and his family had been together playing cards until late in the evening. Detectives collected genetic samples and fingerprints from the family members, comparing them to the evidence gathered from the apartment. The genetic markers retrieved from the hand-rolled cigarette did not match Chow or any family members, nor did they match any existing profiles within the national database. Because the database primarily contained records of adult individuals with prior major convictions, investigators theorized that the contributor might have been a minor at the time, leaving no official record. With no active leads, the investigation gradually slowed, and for 2 years, the case remained quiet, waiting for a spark of truth. That spark arrived in the autumn of 2015. a young man named Willie Guillory, who had recently reached adulthood, was arrested in Houston for a felony offense involving the theft of a horse. Because a felony conviction required the submission of genetic markers to the national database, Willie's profile was officially entered into the system. Almost immediately, a match was signaled. The genetic markers from the hand-rolled cigarette left at the Arlington crime scene 3 years prior belonged to Willie. In October 2015, investigators brought Willie Guillory in for questioning. Confronted with the scientific evidence placing him inside the apartment, the young man, who had been only 16 years old in the summer of 2012, broke down in tears. He confessed to his presence, but insisted he had not acted alone. He revealed that his uncle, Bobby Guillory, had approached him with a plan to travel from Houston to Arlington to perform a task. According to Willie, his uncle possessed a key to the apartment, allowing him to enter and stage a scene to resemble a random burglary. They brought the bandana, the glass bottle, and the other items to mislead the authorities. Willie admitted that when the couple returned home, a struggle ensued, and they ultimately used the tape to secure them within the closet before departing back to Houston. When asked why they would target a gentle, elderly couple, Willie revealed a shocking truth. It was a coordinated plan orchestrated by the Houston-based spiritual advisor, Daphne Wright. Willie explained that Daphne had claimed the family owed her a substantial amount of money and had declared that if they did not pay, she wanted them gone. With this vital information, detectives secured warrants for Bobby Guillory. In December 2015, they located the 52-year-old Bobby in Katy, Texas. Faced with the reality of the charges against him, Bobby also confessed. He explained that in 2011, he had been facing extreme financial hardship and was desperate to support himself. Daphne Wright, knowing his struggles, offered him $10,000 to carry out the deed. Bobby explained that Daphne functioned as a demanding spiritual lender. Chow, Tran, and Hong Lu had continued to pour thousands of dollars into her services in a desperate bid to save their business, running up an informal debt that ballooned to between $250,000 and $280,000. When Daphne demanded payment, the family could not produce the funds. Knowing that substantial life insurance policies existed, a plan was formed to collect on those policies to satisfy the debt. Most startling of all, Bobby claimed that the key to the apartment had been provided by Chow Tran himself. Seeking to verify these claims, detectives focused on Daphne Wright. At her home in Houston, they found an organized household where Daphne was clearly the central figure. A search of her residence revealed detailed business ledgers showing that she charged clients tens of thousands of dollars for her spiritual services. While her husband maintained total ignorance of any wrongdoing, Daphne remained cold and distant, refusing to speak without her legal counsel. To build a solid case against the mastermind of the plot, prosecutors knew they needed definitive testimony. They turned to Chow Tran, analyzing his financial records and discovering that since the tragedy, he had closed a sewing business and purchased a new home under the guidance of his attorney. Chow agreed to cooperate in exchange for immunity from prosecution. Chow provided a narrative that painted a picture of psychological control. He claimed that he and his mother-in-law were terrified of Daphne's perceived spiritual powers, believing she could place devastating curses upon them if they failed to pay. He claimed that Hong, out of deep devotion to her family, had suggested sacrificing her own life so the insurance proceeds could clear their debts. Chow asserted that Daphne had eagerly embraced the idea, insisting that both elders must pass, so that the full debt could be recovered from the duel. Policies. Chow admitted to placing the key under an outdoor mat for Bobby to retrieve. In August of 2019, the trial of Daphne Wright commenced. Chow Tran took the stand, testifying extensively about the financial demands and the psychological pressure Daphne exerted over his family. The defense vigorously contested his credibility, arguing that Chow was motivated by personal greed to claim the life insurance funds and had used the narrative of spiritual manipulation to shield himself from his own choices. The jury listened attentively to the complex web of relationships, traditional beliefs, and financial desperation. In September of 2019, they returned with a verdict of guilty on the charges of capital murder. Daphne Wright was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, ensuring she would have ample time to reflect on the choices that led to this quiet end. Though the legal proceedings concluded and the community gradually returned to its peaceful rhythm, the story remained a profound lesson for all who heard it. It served as a powerful reminder of the dangers of allowing desperation to cloud judgment, the importance of seeking help through open, positive channels, and the enduring strength of a community that stands together in search of truth. Justice had been served, restoring peace to the quiet streets of Arlington, where the memory of Long and Hong lived on in the hearts of those who loved them, reminding everyone that love, truth, and integrity are the true foundations of any dream. The morning sun over Arlington, Texas, usually brings with a warm, golden promise of a new day, painting the wide southern skies in shades of amber and pale blue. It is a vibrant city, a bustling tapestry of diverse cultures, traditions, and families who travel from all corners of the globe to build their own versions of the American dream. Among the most cherished members of this thriving community were Long Nguyen and Hong Lee. Having immigrated from Vietnam in the year 2000, the elderly couple had spent over a decade establishing a peaceful life. Surrounded by their 3 children and grandchildren, they brought with them a deep respect for their heritage, a strong work ethic, and an unwavering kindness that quickly earned them the love of everyone they met in their neighborhood. But on the morning of June 10th, 2012, that peaceful serenity was shattered. At exactly 7:29 in the morning, an emergency dispatcher received a frantic call from a 38-year-old Vietnamese immigrant named Chow Tran, who was requesting a welfare check on his elderly in-laws. His voice trembled with anxiety as he tried to explain the situation to the operator. He explained that his family had gathered outside the apartment complex where Long and Hong lived. They had knocked on the door, but there was no response. His teenage son had tried to peer through the windows and noticed that one of them was slightly open, and things inside appeared to be in disarray. Too terrified to enter the residence themselves, the family waited outside, praying that everything would be all right. Officer Weller, a dedicated officer with 14 years of service on the force, was the first to arrive on the scene. He was accustomed to the usual routine of welfare checks, but as he pulled up to the apartment complex, he immediately sensed that something was different. It was unusually early in the morning for such a request, and seeing an entire family gathered outside in the driveway, visibly shaken and pale with worry, made his instincts kick in. With his flashlight in hand, Officer Weller entered the quiet apartment. The silence inside was heavy, almost suffocating. As he moved through the rooms, he noticed the classic signs of a break-in. The living room was in complete disarray. Compact discs were scattered across the floor, and furniture was overturned as if someone had been desperately searching for valuables. He called out, his voice echoing off the walls, but there was no answer. He checked the kitchen, the bathroom, and then walked into the bedroom. At first glance, the bedroom appeared empty. Officer Weller turned around, preparing to leave the room and report back to the family, thinking perhaps the elderly couple had simply gone out for an early morning walk. But just as he turned toward the door, his flashlight beam caught something unusual. Next to a very small closet door, there were distinct dark hand smudges on the wall. A sudden, chilling sensation washed over him. Every instinct honed over his 14 years of duty told him to proceed with caution. He hesitated for a brief moment, breathing in the quiet air, before reaching out and opening the closet door. Inside, the devastating reality of a terrible crime was revealed. Long Nguyen and Hong Lee were found bound with heavy duct tape, hidden away in the dark space. There was no breath left in them, and the sheer brutality of the scene left the seasoned officer in a state of absolute shock. Officer Weller walked out of the bedroom into the middle of the living room, unable to speak or even use his radio for several long seconds. When he finally found his voice, he contacted his dispatchers to request a supervisor in the homicide unit. The investigation was quickly handed over to Detective Stewart, a veteran homicide investigator with 21 years of experience. Even for someone who had spent over 2 decades dealing with the darkest aspects of human nature, this crime scene was particularly harrowing. It was clear that a violent struggle had taken place, starting right at the front door. There were signs of blunt force trauma on the victims, and the sheer volume of duct tape used to bind them suggested a cold, calculated cruelty. Yet, as the crime scene investigators began to meticulously process the apartment, they discovered a series of clues that seemed almost too convenient. On the coffee table lay a plate of crushed prescription pills, alongside a half-burned marijuana cigarette. Most striking of all was a light blue bandana carefully wrapped around a beer bottle, left in plain sight. In Arlington, certain local gangs were known to use blue bandanas as their signature color, often leaving them behind as a way to claim responsibility or extort local business owners. To an outsider, it looked like a clear-cut case of a robbery committed by local gang members. But Detective Stewart and his team were skeptical. The crime scene felt staged, as if someone had deliberately placed these items to point the police in the wrong direction. The detectives began their work by interviewing the family members, seeking to understand who would want to harm such a gentle, hard-working couple. The only family member composed enough to speak with the investigators was Chow Tran, the son-in-law. Chow explained that the family had gathered the night before to celebrate his father-in-law's birthday. The couple had a wonderful time and stayed until 10:30 in the evening, when another relative drove them home. That was the last time anyone had seen them alive. Chow also shared details about the family business. When Long and Hong first arrived in Texas, they had started a commercial sewing business, enlisting Chow to help manage it because of his strong English skills. For a time, they had achieved remarkable success, even securing prestigious contracts with major commercial brands like Disney. However, by the year 2011, their good fortune had begun to fade. They lost their primary contracts, and the business began to decline rapidly, leaving the family in deep financial distress. To cope with this heavy burden, the deeply traditional couple turned to spiritual beliefs from their homeland. They believed that their string of bad luck was a result of a spiritual curse, and they began searching for someone who could perform rituals to lift the heavy cloud hanging over their lives. Through a local Vietnamese newspaper, Chow and his mother-in-law discovered an advertisement for a spiritual advisor located 250 miles away in Houston. This advisor, a woman named Daphne Wright, claimed she possessed the power to remove negative energy, lift curses, and restore prosperity. Desperate to save their business and protect their family, Hong Lee and Chow contacted Daphne and traveled to her home for a consultation. Over the course of the following year, they placed their ultimate trust in her, hoping that her rituals would turn their fortunes around. Instead of finding peace, however, they found themselves trapped in an even deeper hole. As the investigation continued, the detectives attended the autopsy at the Tarrant County Medical Examiner's office. The medical examiner confirmed that while the victims had suffered physical trauma, the actual cause of death was suffocation due to layers of duct tape wrapped tightly around their faces. It was a heartbreaking revelation that only strengthened the detectives' resolve to bring the perpetrators to justice. A breakthrough in the case came from an unexpected source. Detective Stewart received a call from an insurance company, informing him that the elderly couple held a substantial life insurance policy worth at least $1 million, with Chow Tran named as one of the primary beneficiaries. While Chow had a solid alibi for the night of the murders, cooperating fully with the police and providing DNA and fingerprint samples, the detectives kept all possibilities open. They tested the DNA from the marijuana cigarette found at the scene, but it did not match anyone in the national database at the time. With no immediate matches and no new leads, the case unfortunately went cold for over 2 years. Then, in October the year 2015, a sudden spark brought the investigation back to life. The National DNA Database flagged a match for the DNA found on the marijuana cigarette from the crime scene. The match belonged to Willie Guillory, who had recently been convicted of felony involving the theft of a horse in Houston. Back in the year 2012, Willie had been only 16 years old with no prior criminal record, which was why his DNA had not been in the system when the murders first occurred. Detectives wasted no time in bringing the young man in for questioning. When confronted with the scientific evidence linking him directly to the apartment in Arlington, Willie broke down in tears and confessed. He revealed that he had not acted alone. He had been accompanied by his uncle, Bobby Guillory, a 52-year-old man who was struggling financially at the time. Even more shocking was Willie's revelation that they had been hired to commit the crime by none other than Daphne Wright, the spiritual advisor from Houston. According to Willie, Daphne had orchestrated the entire plan because the family owed her an astronomical amount of money for her services, somewhere between $250,000 and $280,000. When the family was unable to pay, Daphne decided to collect the money by targeting their life insurance policies. On December 16, 2015, police arrested Bobby Guillory. Facing the weight of the evidence, Bobby also confessed, confirming his nephew's story. He admitted that Daphne had promised him $10,000 to carry out the deed, taking advantage of his financial desperation. Bobby further revealed that Daphne had provided him with the key to the apartment, which she had allegedly obtained from Chow Tran himself. Armed with this critical information, detectives arrested Daphne right at her home in Houston. During a search of her residence, investigators discovered detailed financial ledgers showing that she regularly charged clients tens of thousands of dollars for her spiritual services. In August of the year 2019, Daphne Wright was brought to trial. The courtroom was filled with tension as Chow Tran, who had been granted immunity in exchange for his testimony, took the stand. Chow described how Daphne had used her spiritual influence to control and manipulate his family, creating a sense of fear that ultimately led to the tragic events. The defense argued that Chow was far more complicit than he claimed, pointing out that he had ultimately received a substantial financial payout from the insurance policies. After hearing all the evidence, the jury found Daphne Wright guilty of capital murder. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, ensuring that she would never again be able to exploit or harm others. Bobby and Willie Guillory were also held accountable for their roles in the crime, though some questions regarding the full extent of everyone's involvement remained. The dedication of the Arlington Police Department ensured that the truth was brought to light. The memory of Long Nguyen and Hong Lee lived on through their children and a community that loved them, serving as a reminder of the enduring power of justice, the strength of family bonds, and the ultimate triumph of truth over darkness. The American dream is a fragile tapestry, woven with threads of hope, ambition, and the relentless pursuit of a better life. For Long Nguyen and Hong Lee, this dream began with a journey across the ocean, leaving behind the familiar landscapes of Vietnam to build a future for their children in the sprawling, culturally diverse city of Arlington, Texas. By the turn of the millennium, the couple had established themselves as pillars of their community, embodying the resilience and industry of those who seek to turn a vision into reality. They were not merely immigrants. They were architects of a family legacy, working tirelessly in the commercial sewing industry, eventually securing contracts that promised stability and prosperity. Yet, life has a way of introducing unforeseen variables into even the most carefully constructed plans. By the year 2011, the winds of fortune had shifted. The lucrative contracts that had sustained their livelihood began to vanish, and the business once a beacon of success, started to drift into precarious waters of financial instability. In moments of profound distress, human beings often reach for anchors that transcend the material world. Long and Hong, deeply rooted in their traditional beliefs, sought solace and guidance in the ancient mysticism of their homeland. They believed that their misfortune was not merely a matter of economic fluctuations, but perhaps the result of unseen forces, curses that required spiritual intervention to be lifted. In their search for restoration, they were led to a woman named Daphne Wright, a spiritual advisor operating out of Houston. To the desperate, the promise of a savior often appears as a guiding light, and Daphne positioned herself as a conduit for fortune, claiming the power to remove malevolent curses and restore prosperity. Entrusted with their faith and their dwindling finances, the couple began a cycle of payments that would ultimately prove to be their undoing. What began as a search for blessing descended into a dark, coercive relationship as their debt to Daphne ballooned into hundreds of thousands of dollars. The spiritual advisor revealed a much colder, more transactional nature than the couple had ever anticipated. The atmosphere of the Nguyen household, once defined by the warmth of family gatherings and the quiet pride of hard work, became thick with an unspoken, suffocating tension. Behind closed doors, the pressure to satisfy Daphne's insatiable demands grew unbearable. Her influence over the family was not based on divine benevolence, but on the exploitation of fear and the psychological chains she had forged through their shared desperation. When the payments failed to manifest, the tone of her communications shifted from mystical guidance to lethal ultimatums. She made it clear that her financial interests were absolute, and the cost of non-payment would be nothing short of life itself. The fateful day arrived on June the 10th, 2012. The quiet morning in Arlington was shattered by a welfare check request that would reveal a scene of unimaginable horror. Chow Tran, the son-in-law of the victims, had reached out to emergency dispatchers, his voice heavy with a foreboding that permeated the family. Upon the arrival of law enforcement, the residents presented a tableau of chaos that defied the peaceful reputation of the inhabitants. Investigators were confronted with a scene that appeared, at first glance, to be a burglary that had escalated into tragedy. However, the sheer brutality of the act, the hog-tied victims, the extensive use of duct tape, and the calculated violence pointed toward a motive far more sinister than simple theft. As detectives delved deeper into the wreckage of the lives left behind, they navigated a labyrinth of deception. The crime scene was cluttered with items intended to mislead: a blue bandana, a beer bottle, and traces of narcotics, all carefully arranged to cast suspicion upon local gang activity. Yet, for the seasoned investigators, these clues felt too orchestrated, a performance designed to obscure a much colder, more deliberate truth. The investigation soon shifted from the streets to the heart of the family, as the presence of a substantial life insurance policy cast a long, cynical shadow over the grieving relatives. The path to uncovering the truth was long and fraught with silence. For 3 years, the case remained in the cold, unyielding grip of uncertainty, a haunting reminder of lives cut short. It was only through the intervention of chance, a separate felony arrest of a young man named Willie Guillory, that the facade began to crumble. When DNA evidence retrieved from the crime scene finally linked back to Willie, the walls of the conspirators' silence began to collapse. Willie, who had been a mere teenager at the time of the crime, described a terrifying sequence of events dictated by his uncle, Bobby Guillory, and ultimately orchestrated by the woman they feared above all others, Daphne Wright. The narrative that emerged was one of a calculated, cold-blooded murder-for-hire scheme. Daphne had not only leveraged the couple's spiritual beliefs against them, but had also infiltrated their circle, manipulating their fear to ensure the successful execution of her lethal demands. Bobby Guillory, desperate and hungry, had been transformed into an instrument of her greed, fueled by the promise of financial reward. The revelation that the keys to the home had been provided, the scene staged to divert blame, and the cold logic used to justify the loss of human life left investigators and the community reeling. The subsequent trials unfolded as a stark examination of the power dynamics between the predator and the prey. Daphne Wright, the self-proclaimed spiritual savior, was unmasked as a heartless architect of destruction, despite the legal complexities and the labyrinthine testimony of those involved. The weight of the evidence proved insurmountable. The jury's conviction of Daphne stood as a testament to the pursuit of justice, ensuring that she would spend the remainder of her life behind bars, removed from the society she had so ruthlessly exploited. For those who investigated the case, the outcome left a lingering, bittersweet resonance. While a measure of accountability had been achieved, the moral ambiguity surrounding the involvement of other family members continued to haunt the edges of the narrative. The tragedy of Long and Hong served as a profound reminder of the vulnerability of the human spirit when confronted by the intersection of blind faith and calculated malice. Their American dream, once vibrant and full of promise, had been silenced by the greed of a few, leaving behind a legacy that now serves as a cautionary tale for all who value the sanctity of life and the dangers of placing absolute trust in the hands of those who offer miracles at a price. As the case closed, the truth remained. The shadows of the past could be long, but eventually, even the deepest darkness must yield to the light of discovery. The summer heat in Texas has a way of pressing down on a city like a heavy, humid hand. In the early morning hours of June 10, 2012, the city of Arlington was already beginning to simmer under a pale blue sky. On most days, this part of the state woke up to the quiet hum of air conditioners and the distant murmur of highway traffic. But on this particular Sunday, the silence in one suburban neighborhood was about to be shattered by a revelation so grim that it would linger in the minds of veteran investigators for decades to come. Officer Weller had seen his fair share of troubled mornings during his 14 years on the force. He was a man who believed in the simple, quiet order of community life. When a dispatch call came through at 7:29 in the morning, it seemed like a routine matter, the kind of call that usually ended with a polite conversation and a sigh of relief. A welfare check had been requested by a 38-year-old Vietnamese immigrant named Chow Tran. Chow had called the emergency line, his voice trembling with a mixture of anxiety and confusion, asking officers to check on his elderly in-laws, Long Nguyen and Hong Lu. When Officer Weller arrived at the apartment complex, the scene immediately struck him as unusual. Typically, a